Hello, thank you for watching my channel today. My name is Sarah and my channel is called Your Tree Shelf. Today I am filming my February wrap up. I read a total of 5 books in February, one of which was non-fiction and 4 of which were fiction. So I'll kick off with the first one, which has now gone back to the library, so I can't hold it up for you. The first one was A Dark Circle by Linda Grant. This is the first Linda Grant book that I've read, and it's set in the 1950s, and it's basically set in one of the first TV sanatoriums. So it was a purpose-built sanatorium which was funded by a family whose daughter had died as a child with TB, and they'd set up this sanatorium as her legacy. And it's following some twins from London who are teenagers, and it follows those two and a few of the other residents who live at the sanatorium, and it goes through basically their stories and the doctor who is in charge, who is very dubious. He has TB himself, and they basically, at the time, there was no cure for TB, and they thought that putting people outside in the fresh air was the best thing they could do. Sometimes they induced a pneumothorax, which is basically where they would artificially collapse a person's lung to rest it. And sometimes they removed their ribs, or some of the ribs on one side to try and... I'm not really quite sure what they were doing when they were removing ribs, but it's pretty barbaric. And these people were literally made to go outside and sleep outside in the snow and all sorts to try and sort of get this air into their lungs. So that was really interesting. So I didn't really know much about it, and there was a really horrific bit of the book where they described that there's this kind of hidden floor upstairs that nobody knew was being used for children, and because the children obviously didn't want to rest all the time, and so they would tie them to the beds and put them in straitjackets to stop them from misbehaving and running around and things, and it's just awful. So to find out about stuff like that was interesting, if not horrible at times, but I just found that the actual story didn't really hold my attention very much. So like, I can't remember the characters' names really now, and it's not one that will stay with me. The factual stuff was interesting, but I didn't really root for the characters very much. I didn't find them very full, and so it was, for me, a 3-star book. The second one that I read was so I read the first 2 books of a trilogy. Basically, these were romance books, and I have always kind of liked romance as a genre, but always been a bit embarrassed that I liked it, and just a bit like, because I know people can be quite snobby about people reading romance, and I know that shouldn't bother me, but it always kind of did. And then I watched a video that Jean did of Jean's Bookish Thoughts, where the video, I'll link it, but the video was called Do I Like Romance Novels? And she actually sort of started by saying she didn't think that she did, but then when she went through a load of romances that she realised she did like, the genre. And that really kind of gave me the confidence, I guess, to admit that I do like romance. Sounds so sad, doesn't it, that I just didn't have the confidence to do so. And I also follow Bree Hill on BookTube, and she basically solely reads romance. And I heard her speaking on the romance episode of the Reading Women podcast, and which they did around Valentine's Day, and she gave some recommendations about romances, and I was going to put them on my Amazon wish list because that's how I sort of keep a record of all the books that I want. And I noticed that the first one in the series was free on Kindle, so I don't have a Kindle, but I downloaded it on my phone, and then when I was feeding my little boy at night, I just read it on my phone. So it started like that, and then I started reading it a lot more because I really got into it. So the trilogy is, the first one is called Flow, and the second one is called Grip, and they are by Kennedy Ryan. There's a third one called Still, which I haven't read yet, but I ended up reading the first book and the second book this month. So, after all that, after all that preamble, this is basically follows the relationship between a white girl called Bristol and a black man called Grip. And Bristol has been estranged from her family. She is a twin with her brother Ryson, who is a musical genius, and he emancipated himself from the family because his parents forced him to do a lot of musicianship and touring and things when he was a child, and he had enough of it. So he sort of left the family, and Bristol never really measured up, and she decides to go and visit him to try and build bridges. And she meets his friend Grip, who's his best friend. They basically have, over the course of a week, they fall in love, and then something happens which separates them. And because it's an interracial romance, there's a lot of cultural issues, I suppose is the right word, which are discussed kind of at length in the book about people's opinions on interracial relationships. And Bristol and Grip discuss a lot of kind of cultural issues, like about language and about assumptions and about the relationship between people of colour and the police in the States. And there's lots of really good discussion about that and those issues. And the romance is really really good. It really sort of keeps you on your toes. It makes you like desperate to find out what's going to happen. It builds up so much tension. And when I finished the first book, I literally was like, I can't stop there, because it was left on such a cliffhanger that I went and straight away bought and started the second one on the Kindle store as well. So can't really say too much more about the plot because I'll give away big spoilers, and I don't want to do that. But it's a love story. It's quite explicit. It's just really like fiery and passionate, and like I say, it's got this interesting dynamic, and that is talking about an interracial relationship. And yeah, I really loved it. I think I gave them both 4 stars. I didn't give them 5 just because the writing isn't amazing. It's good, it's fine, but it's not literary, which is fine. I mean, saying that is kind of annoying myself because I don't always need a book to be literary, and that's not what this set out to be. But it didn't get that extra like something by having 5 stars. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm definitely going to read Still, which is the 3rd one in the series. Book 2 wasn't left on such a cliffhanger, so I didn't go straight out and buy the 3rd one, but I'm definitely going to read it soon. So that was my books 2 and 3. The 4th book I read was this one, which is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. So, excuse me, I saw this book on BookTube quite a few times, and then it turned out to be one of the Feminist Orchestra Book Club books of last year, which is run by Lauren Wade and Jean. And this was actually written in the 70s, and seems to be having a bit of a resurgence on BookTube at the moment. This is about a girl called Dana who is transported back in time out of the blue into the 1800s in America when slavery still exists. So Dana is black, and when she gets transported back in time, she is assumed to be a slave, and she has to live. She lives in the house of a slave-owning family. And she's basically, every time she's called back in time, it's to save the life of a boy called Rufus. Rufus, she finds out very early in the story, so this isn't a spoiler, is very many generations ago a relative of hers. And she keeps coming back to save his life. And she's put in very difficult positions because he's a slave owner. And so he does some things which are despicable, but she has this sort of... not romantic, but she has this relationship with him which makes her keep saving him even though she hates and despises the things that he's doing. And you get to know the slaves, you get to know their families, you get to know what life was like a little bit for them, and it really hooked me in. Like Dana is also married to a white man, so this is another book with an interracial relationship, which wasn't covered in anywhere near as much depth really. The main sticking points was that one time her husband Kevin, he's holding on to her when she goes back in time, and so he comes back in time with her, and because he's white at that time, he's assumed to be Dana's owner, and it adds a different dynamic to their relationship, and it makes her quite shocked at some of the things that he accepts. And so it does put some strain in their relationship, but it doesn't really go into it in massive depth. This book I gave 4 stars again. I really was drawn into the parts when Dana was in the past, and I really cared about the characters. I really cared about the slaves. I was really upset by some of the things that happened in the book. I didn't find Dana and Kevin's relationship believable because there didn't seem to be much in the way of love between them. They said they loved each other, but it wasn't really gone into in any depth in the book. They just seemed to be kind of married, but that was all the explanation that you got. You didn't really know too much about their relationship. They didn't seem to miss each other that much when they were apart. And so that was the sort of the least believable part. There's not much set in present day America, and those bits almost felt like they were just a stopgap until you went back in time again. I was really interested to see how it was going to wrap up, and I would definitely recommend it, but it didn't blow me away. And then the final book that I read this month was one of the Wellcome Prize longlist books, which was Amateur by Thomas Page McBee. So this one is a story about Thomas, who is a trans male. So he was born female and he transitioned in the, I think it's about the early teens, as in like the 2013-ish, something like that. He is then exploring what it means to be a man and how it feels different to be a man, and he decides that he's going to do a charity boxing match in Madison Square Garden to explore masculinity and violence. So he's training in gyms in the States, in New York, and he isn't talking, he doesn't tell hardly anybody that he's trans, and he talks about why he questions himself why he's doing that. He's saying, why am I afraid to talk about it? He also talks a lot about this really unique perspective that he has, because he was born a girl, and so he experienced what it was like to be a woman before he transitioned, and he experienced what it was like to be cut off in conversation. He experienced what it was like to be afraid of men. He experienced abuse. He experienced what it was like to be a victim of sexual violence. He knew what it was like to have your ideas looked over for a man's ideas. And then when he became a man, he then saw it from the other side, and he found sometimes that he was talking over women, and that people were listening to his opinions and not their opinions, and that he was automatically assumed to have the skills and the confidence that he needed to do certain things even if he didn't. And the other thing he found was that he was afraid, like say he was going out jogging training, he was afraid to jog near or past a woman in case she was afraid that he might be a predator and he might be a threat to her. And so he then he said, like, if he wanted to just give someone a hug or something, he would then feel like he couldn't just do that anymore in case people were interpreting his behaviour in the wrong way. So he has this really unique perspective of what it's like to be male and female at different times in his life, and that really adds a dimension to the book that you couldn't have unless you'd been in that position. He also comes to realise with the boxing, because we think of boxing as being a very like sort of aggressive and vicious and brutal sport, that he talks about how men have, or not all men obviously, but some men find it really difficult to open up to each other, to be tactile with each other, to hug each other. And yet in boxing, even though this is a really kind of masculine environment, the men are really like the opposite. Like they'll support each other, they'll tell each other really personal things, they'll hug each other, they'll have a lot less boundaries and limits and insecurities in that way than they do outside of the gym. There's this sort of brotherhood that they form in the gyms. So he explores the sort of duality of that as well. So I found the book was really interesting. It wasn't like gripping, but I don't think it was sort of supposed to be, because it was a memoir really. So I gave it, I think, 4 stars, and I'm really looking forward to kind of reading more on the long list, because I would never have heard of that book, I don't think, if I hadn't been reading through the long list. So yeah, so that's everything that I completed in the month of February. So let me know your thoughts on the books that I've read. Are you tempted to read any romance? Is there any kind of books that you feel a bit embarrassed to admit that you like? Have you read any of the books that I mentioned on the list, and what did you think? And I hope that you are having a good week, and I will speak to you soon. Bye.